David Patrick Mazurek, or Mazz as he's known to his friends, the few friends he has. Mazz is pretty much a loner. Mazz likes to surf. Mazz lived in a small town on the California coast. People would see him head for the beach and they'd say, "There goes Dave Mazurek, the billionaire." But that was only half true. Mazz was one of the stars of Silicon Valley. Mazz and his high school buddy Tom Fletcher started one of the big tech companies in the 1990s that became a household word. 10 years later, Tom bought out Mazz, and Mazz retired to become a full-time surfer. Mazz was estimated to be worth somewhere around $400 million. Tom Fletcher became a billionaire several times over. Tom and his wife Kimiko Hashimoto had parties at their spectacular villa on the coast. Sometimes they invited Mazz. Kimiko was an artist, so the guests were an interesting mix of bohemians, tech geeks, and high-rolling investors. It was at one of these parties that Tom told Mazz that he and Kimiko were planning to leave the country because of abrupt climate change. "In a few short years, the Arctic Ocean will be ice-free," Tom said. "When the Blue Ocean event occurs, civilization will collapse, but Kimiko and I won't be here to see and experience the mayhem." Tom explained that he and a small group of billionaires had bought a chain of islands in the South Pacific. The atoll was so tiny it didn't even have a name. It was known as SP-20. "Really," Mazz said, "you expect it to happen that fast?" "Absolutely," Tom said. "Here, I'll explain. Look at your drink and imagine that there was hot sun beating down on it. All the sun's heat would be working to melt the ice at the top, but your drink would stay cool. But when the ice is gone, the sun's energy begins warming your drink. It's the same in the Arctic. Without the ice, the oceans will warm rapidly. With a rapidly warming Arctic Ocean, the jet stream will no longer drive the weather in the northern hemisphere. Extreme droughts and storms will be the new normal. A warm Arctic will thaw frozen sediments, releasing huge quantities of methane into the atmosphere, a potent greenhouse gas. Temperatures will increase rapidly. In a short time," Tom said, "everything goes to hell." "What about rising sea levels?" Mazz asked. "Aren't you taking a big risk living on an island?" "In the long term, yes," Tom replied. "But in the near term, we're facing the sudden collapse of industrial civilization. Millions will die from famine, breakdown of law and order, even war. But we'll be safe in our island chain. We have one habitable island left for sale. If you're interested, let me know. Tomorrow at the latest." When Mazz drove home, he researched everything Tom told him about abrupt climate change. The facts were undeniable, the science unrefutable. The collapse of industrial civilization was imminent, and soon after, the human species faced extinction. The next day, Mazz called Tom. "I'm in," Mazz said. "I'll buy the island." Mazz bought one of the islands from Tom and made arrangements to fly to the South Pacific to supervise the outfitting of his new home. Mazz's parents passed away years ago, so only Jan, his sometimes girlfriend, saw him off. "You'll be back," Jan said. Mazz flew first class on a commercial jet to New Zealand. Mazz was met at the airport by Dennis Miller, another Silicon Valley billionaire, and his husband, Hector Fernandez. Hector was going to pilot the plane to their island. During the flight, Dennis told Mazz about SP-20 and some of its history. The island chain was on top of a submerged extinct volcano surrounded by a coral reef. The islands lacked fresh water. They were briefly inhabited by the Japanese army and the American army and abandoned by both. Concrete pillboxes and bunkers were repurposed by the new inhabitants. The biggest island was owned by Tom Fletcher and his wife Kimiko Hashimoto. Their island house was more luxurious than any of the 10 homes they owned throughout the world. Sam Wainwright, the hedge fund king, owned the next biggest island with his wife Amanda. Their daughter Rebecca and her husband Seth would live on a nearby island. "The island west of your island," Dennis said, "is owned by John Clark, the real estate tycoon, and his wife Erica." 2 hours later, the plane arrived at SP-20. Hector circled low over the atoll so Mazz could get a good look. The plane banked and turned. "That's our island," Dennis said. "The Japanese built the landing strip during World War II, and the Yanks lengthened it just before they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima." A short while later, Dennis and Hector took Mazz across the lagoon to his island in their electric boat. "This is your island," Dennis said. "It's a rocky one. The only place to land a boat is through that narrow inlet." Hector and Dennis dropped Mazz off and headed back to their island. Mazz stood on the dock and looked at his tropical island paradise and said to himself, "I think I'm going to like it here." A man stood at the end of the dock and waved to Mazz. "I'm Tony, your survival consultant," the man said as he walked over and shook Mazz's hand. "Tom Fletcher sent me here to prep your island. Come on up to your compound." At the top of the hill, hidden from the lagoon, was a small building. Tony waved to it and said, "This is your new home, Mazz. Why don't you stow your gear and put on some hiking shoes? I'll give you a tour." Tony began his tour with the water system. "There's no surface or groundwater on this island," he said, "so you'll have to collect rainwater. There's also a desalination backup." Tony showed Mazz the solar and wind generators. "There's enough power and battery storage for all your household needs and the electric boat." Tony showed Mazz his radio shack. "On a good day," Tony said, "you should be able to tune into shortwave radio stations around the world. It's a good way to keep track of the world going to hell in a handbasket while you sit here in paradise." Tony invited Mazz to inspect the storeroom built into the side of the hill. "You have enough freeze-dried, shrink-wrapped food to last 30 years or more. You also have a garden and seeds if you want something fresh and green. And as long as the sun shines," Tony said, "you can cook with this solar oven." Tony took a device off a shelf and showed it to Mazz. "This is a radiation detector. You may not need it. On the other hand, I've heard rumors that the elites in a few nations are planning to set off some nukes to create a nuclear winter to geoengineer a pause in the rate of global warming. It's a desperate measure to be sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if they tried it." Tony continued, "Setting off nukes would kick up a lot of smoke and dust. The resulting nuclear winter would keep temperatures down a few degrees. But when all the dust and aerosols fall out of the atmosphere, the heat will come roaring back with a vengeance. You'll also have a lot of radioactive fallout and increased ultraviolet radiation from the destruction of the ozone layer. That's why I packed you a hazmat suit and some eye protection for when you go outside. It's just a precaution." "Which gets me to your defense capabilities," Tony said. "You have boxes of weapons and ammunition in the storeroom. I'd familiarize yourself with them." Tony pointed to the harbor entrance. "That's your weak spot, Mazz. You got sheer cliffs everywhere else on the island. I packed some mines for you, enough to blow up a small navy. Just string them across that entrance." Mazz wasn't happy about the weapons. "I hope I don't have to do anything like that. I'm not a violent person," Mazz said. Tony removed his sunglasses and looked Mazz straight in his eyes. "I hope you don't have to use it either, Mazz. But just the same, you're all by your lonesome on this island, Boy Scout, so you're better off being prepared." After the tour, Mazz and Tony walked down to the dock. Tony said, "My job is done here," as he prepared to leave. "I'm heading back home to Montana." "How are you prepared to survive after the Blue Ocean event?" Mazz asked. "Well," Tony said, "I figure my wife and I have a little time after everything goes to hell. After that, well, we've got a case of bourbon to drink, and if it's really bad, we'll swallow our forever pills." "Forever pills?" asked Mazz. "Yeah," Tony replied. "It's a last resort. I packed a few for you. They're painless and fast-acting. You know what they say, when everything comes unglued, the living will envy the dead." As Mazz watched Tony's boat fade into the sunset, he thought about what Tony said. Will it really come to that? Will the living really envy the dead? After 4 months, Mazz got used to living on his island. He kept himself busy. He liked to go snorkeling and spearfishing. Mazz had become something of a caretaker for the homes on the other islands. He liked to windsurf around the blue-green lagoon and visit each island. Every day, Mazz listened to the news on the shortwave radio. One day, Mazz heard a news report about the disappearance of ice in the Arctic Sea. It was the Blue Ocean event Tom Fletcher told him about at the party. The announcer made it sound like the Blue Ocean event was a good thing. There was now an open Northwest Passage for shipping and oil exploration. A few days later, Dennis and Hector's plane returned to the atoll. The Blue Ocean event was the signal for Mazz's neighbors to leave civilization and escape to the islands. Tom Fletcher, Kimiko Hashimoto, and John and Erica Clark flew on Dennis and Hector's plane. Mazz asked Tom about the broadcast he heard about the Blue Ocean event. Tom said the optimistic reports were meant to prevent panic, so wealthy and powerful people could escape to their island and mountain hideaways. 4 days later, Sam Wainwright moored his schooner in the lagoon. On board was his family. That evening, Tom and Kimiko threw a party on their island to welcome everyone. The guests seemed to be in a jolly mood. Mazz listened into some of the conversation. Erica Clark told Rebecca Wainwright that she was pregnant. Rebecca said that she and Seth had talked about starting a family too. A short while later, Mazz overheard John Clark tell Sam Wainwright, "When all of this stuff blows over, I expect the stock market's gonna recover." Sam Wainwright agreed. "I'm keeping my investments right where they are." Mazz pulled Tom aside. "Tom," Mazz asked, "these people are delusional. Didn't you tell them what you told me?" "I told them," Tom replied. "They know, but they choose to pretend that there's a future for them. It's not easy to live without hopium." "Hopium?" Mazz asked. "What is hopium?" "Hopium," Tom explained, "is whatever techno-fix miracle people believe is going to save us from the abrupt climate change disaster." Mazz was astonished. "But that's crazy, Tom. At some point they're going to have to admit the truth. And then, how will they cope?" "Well," Tom replied, "I guess we'll just have to cross that bridge when we get to it. But for now, let's enjoy ourselves. Can I get you another drink?" Mazz stared into the night sky and thought about what Tom said about hopium. Does everybody think that way? What about people back home? Do they know what's going on? What are they thinking? Maybe they're not thinking. Maybe they're too distracted to think. Billions of people are going to have one heck of a rude awakening, Mazz thought. Over the next 5 months, Mazz monitored the news from the rest of the world over the shortwave radio. At first, there was a great deal of reporting on the official stations about how the business, military, and political elites abandoned them. Then the broadcast focused on the increasing disasters brought on by a world climate out of whack. There were massive floods, huge storms, droughts, forest fires, civil unrest. Then, inexplicably, one by one, the official stations went off the air. Mazz began listening to the lower-powered stations. There was one station in particular Mazz listened to when the atmospheric conditions were good and the signal was strong. The broadcast came from somewhere in rural Indiana. The announcer's name was Linda, but she liked to call herself the Hoosier Honey Badger. She'd start her broadcast saying, "You're listening to the Daily Survival Report from the Pirate Prepper Radio Network," she'd say. "I'm Linda, the Hoosier Honey Badger, and this is the news. As many of you have figured out, we're on our own. But that's just the way I like it, and I figure a lot of my listeners feel that way too. The politicians, the banksters, the generals have abandoned us. But for the most part, we're doing good. We're doing just fine. Citizens have formed local committees to distribute food, fuel, and medicine." Mazz tuned in a few days later. Linda, the Hoosier Honey Badger, had some bad news. Indiana had its first wet bulb, dangerous heat event. Anyone without access to air conditioning died of heat stroke within minutes. When the heat let up and people emerged from their homes and shelters 2 days later, it was a different world. There was no denying anymore or avoiding the fact that abrupt climate change was real and deadly. Mazz listened to the radio the next few days as the complex global industrial system rapidly collapsed. Climate scientists at last were free to speak honestly about abrupt climate change, and the fragile habitat humans needed to survive was disappearing fast. With the knowledge that their time on Earth was short, a great sadness came over everyone. Suddenly people understood that each second of their lives mattered. Everyone felt an overwhelming desire to go home and spend what little time remained with their loved ones. Workers walked off their jobs and went home. Factories shut down. Trucks stopped rolling. Food, fuel, manufactured goods stopped being delivered. Internet and cell phones stopped working. A great migration was underway. In spite of fuel shortages, people were going home any way they could. After industrial activity ceased, The particulates and aerosols began to drop out of the sky. Without the dimming effect of all that pollution, temperatures soared in the northern latitudes. Mazz couldn't take it anymore. He went outside to plant some vegetables he had grown from seed. Suddenly the thought entered his mind that at that very moment millions of people were dying. The complex web of modern civilization was unraveling, just as the habitat humans depended on was collapsing. Patients were dying in hospitals for lack of electricity for their life-saving devices, and dying for lack of medicines. People were starving for lack of food. Mazz was not prepared for the emotions that overwhelmed him as his mind calculated the death toll. Today, millions. Tomorrow, tens of millions. Soon, hundreds of millions. Eventually, billions. The next day, there was another party at Tom and Kimiko's island. Tom arrived in his electric boat to transport Mazz. Mazz decided to tell Tom about what he heard on the radio. Tom, Mazz said, "It's getting really bad back home. Millions of people are dying." "I know," Tom said. "Please don't mention it. Don't mention what you know at the party. Some of the guests are very distraught, and I don't want the news to upset them." A few hours later, some of the men were on the porch drinking cocktails. "Damn it," Seth said. "This whole business could have been avoided." "What business is that?" Dennis Miller asked. "Are you talking about climate change? I don't think any of us knew it would be this bad." "Well," John Clark replied, "some people in powerful positions knew, and they probably could have done something. Am I right, Sam?" "Of course we knew. We knew decades ago," Sam Wainwright revealed. "But what could we do? Scrap modernity and go back to the horse and buggy days?" "We could have done something," Seth interjected. "Billions of people will die, and someday soon we'll join them. The whole damn human species. Everybody's gonna go extinct." Suddenly there was a crash, and everyone turned to see Erica Clark standing over a pile of broken glass in a state of shock. Her husband, John, walked her back into the house. The party broke up soon after. Dennis and Hector gave Mazz a ride home in their electric boat. Halfway across the lagoon, Dennis turned in his chair and asked Mazz if he was planning to go home. "No," Mazz said. "I'm surprised to hear that question." Dennis told Mazz that Kimiko asked Hector to fly her home. She wants to go home to her family in Osaka. We have only enough fuel to get her as far as Auckland. "Does Tom know?" Mazz asked. "Yes," Dennis replied. "Kimiko told Tom right after the party. He's not taking it very well. He's staying here." "What about the others?" Mazz asked. "Are they leaving too?" "Looks that way," Dennis replied. "Sam Wainwright told me he's sailing back with his family. John and Erica are going back with him. We're leaving in a couple of days. We've got room for you on the plane if you change your mind." "No," Mazz replied. "I'm staying. Are you and Hector coming back?" "I don't think so," Dennis said. "Hector and I talked it over. We're not coming back, even if we wanted to. Satellite navigation is down, and we'd have a heck of a time finding these fly specks in the ocean. And besides, I've never been to New Zealand. Hector says it's a beautiful country." A week after the party, Mazz saw Kimiko, Dennis, and Hector off at the landing strip. Dennis and Hector gave Mazz their electric boat and all their supplies. The next day, Mazz saw Sam Wainwright's boat head out to sea. It was just Tom and Mazz now. In the months that followed, Mazz tried to visit Tom as often as he could. Tom was really depressed about Kimiko and the others going home. Tom was drinking heavily and not taking care of himself. Mazz was worried that Tom was cracking up. Then suddenly, Tom seemed to pull himself together and stop drinking. Mazz found Tom working in his garden one day. "It's looking really good," Mazz said. "Thanks," Tom replied. "When Kimiko comes back from Osaka, I want everything to look nice so she'll never leave again." Mazz didn't say anything. How could he tell his friend that Kimiko wasn't coming back to the island? How could Mazz deny life-sustaining hope to his friend, even if that hope was delusional? One morning, Mazz was raising the radio antenna up on a hill. Mazz heard popping noises off in the distance. He saw a wisp of smoke in the direction of Tom's island. Mazz fetched his binoculars. He saw boats and men with guns. "Pirates!" Mazz exclaimed out loud. Mazz quickly found Tony's cache of weapons in the storeroom and with a boat he mined the small entrance to the harbor. Mazz stayed up days and nights waiting for his island to be invaded by the pirates. But the pirates had sailed away, never to return. But Mazz stayed vigilant. One night, weeks later, Mazz heard a tremendous explosion. A boat had detonated 2 of the mines. Mazz went down to look in the morning. There were bodies on the beach, bodies of a man, a woman, and 3 children. These weren't pirates, but a desperate, hungry refugee family. Mazz dug graves for the family on the hillside above his house. A few days later, Mazz retrieved Tom's body from the burnt ruins of his house and buried him alongside the graves of the refugee family. When Mazz thought it was safe to raise the antenna on the hill, he tuned into the few stations remaining on the air. Linda, the Hoosier honey badger, was still broadcasting. The news was getting worse. The heat was rapidly building in the northern hemisphere. Abandoned chemical plants, oil refineries, drilling platforms were all leaking badly. Abandoned nuclear power plants began to melt down. Linda added one final note. "I have this message for my listeners in the southern hemisphere," Linda said. "This mess is heading your way. It may take weeks, it may take months, but it's coming." The Hoosier honey badger continued. "Hubby and I have decided to end the broadcast. Hubby and I are taking our forever pills. Good luck to all of you. Signing off." Mazz sat in stunned silence. Will it be just me, Mazz thought? Will I be the only person left on the planet? Will I be all alone? Weeks after Linda's last broadcast, Mazz's loneliness worsened. Every day he visited the graves of Tom and the refugee family and spoke to them. Gradually the skies over the atoll darkened with the smoke from the northern hemisphere. The temperatures dropped as the sooty shroud dimmed the sun. Mazz wrapped himself in a blanket and breathed through a respirator. When he went outside, he wore his hazmat suit. More worrisome, Mazz's radiation dosimeter climbed steadily every day through the yellow, heading into the red. The skies gradually cleared, but the lack of global dimming forced a rapid increase in temperatures. Plant life on the island was dead and offered no shade. Chemicals and radiation had destroyed the ozone layer, so in spite of the heat, Mazz had to cover up and protect his eyes and skin from the UV rays. Life had become unbearable, but Mazz could not bring himself to swallow his forever pills. He walked one last time to the graves to say goodbye. Mazz loaded a few items into the electric boat. There was enough juice in the batteries to get him beyond the reef that surrounded the atoll. Mazz took off his protective clothes and put on his swimming gear. From the back of the boat, he pulled his board and sail and placed it in the water. Mazz caught a breeze and steered his board eastward. Mazz could no longer be alone. Mazz was going home.